You hear an ear, nose and throat (ENT) specialist called Mark Davison giving a presentation about the causes and treatment of nosebleeds. You now have 90 seconds to read the questions.
Good afternoon, I'm Mark Davison, and my presentation will focus on the causes and treatments of nosebleeds, and the implications for those of us working in the health service. About 60% of people get nosebleeds at some time in their lives, particularly children and older people. Most of these events resolve spontaneously, and the mortality rate from nosebleeds is extremely low. But treating them still costs the health service a lot of money. In my own hospital, over 40% of admissions in ENT involve nosebleeds. Ideally, we'd treat many of these as outpatients, yet the majority of those patients will stay for 5 days. Last year, in my department, €250,000 was spent on the management of this condition. Clearly, any saving on that, if duplicated in hospitals across the country, would have a positive impact on resources for other services. The biggest enemy of the nose is artificial air. In hospitals, we get an awful lot of older people coming in with nosebleeds in the winter months. As you'll know, such patients don't tolerate the cold for various reasons, so they tend to sit beside radiators and heaters, and these dry up the air. This means the cilia, which protect the lining of the nose, dry out, and this in turn exposes the blood vessels, which causes bleeding. Our noses haven't developed a defense mechanism against artificial air. 300 years ago, everybody lived in drafty houses and cold environments. Now we all sit in heated rooms, and the nose hasn't adapted to this. The evolution of an organ can take millions of years, in fact. The immediate cause of a nosebleed can be local trauma or inflammation caused by a simple cold, but systemic diseases have to be ruled out in adults presenting with the condition. People with chronic allergies in the nose are more prone to nosebleeds. And there are some other serious conditions that can present in this way, including cases where the kidney or the liver is no longer functioning as it should. Foreign bodies that enter the nose by some means can trigger nosebleeds, though these are more common in children than in adults, and usually there'd be a foul discharge associated with the foreign body. But for a lot of the nosebleeds we see, about 30%, we can't find a specific cause. A lot of people who are at the age where they get high blood pressure are prone to nosebleeds, but the blood pressure itself doesn't cause them. So, when we see an adult with a nosebleed, we have to consider the systemic cause, not just look at the event itself. Now, there's a pathway of care associated with nosebleeds. First of all, it's advisable to check whether or not the patient's in shock. A loss of at least 500 ml of blood is needed to get the early signs of shock, and it's rare to lose that amount during a common nosebleed. But if you ask any of my colleagues in ENT what they most hate dealing with, it's nosebleeds. This is because they tend to come in late at night, the patient's often very scared, and that sets their blood pressure off, making any further diagnosis and treatment problematic. So, before you can do anything, you have to allay their fears. You might even give them a sedative to try to relax them. You also need to check they're not on any medication like aspirin or warfarin that might affect blood clotting. The next step is to try and find the precise source of the bleeding. The simplest way to stop it is to apply a silver nitrate stick to that point. It's fairly atraumatic, but you can't get those chemical sticks to the back part of the nose, so they're mainly useful for children, who tend to have fewer bleeds from that area than older people. Unfortunately, what often happens when an older patient goes into an emergency department, and there may be no ENT service available, as many such departments don't have them, what often happens is that, because there's so much blood pouring out, the bleeding point can't be located. In this case, a gauze pack will be put into the nose, both in front and behind the nose, to try to put pressure on the whole area and stop the bleeding that way. This can be very traumatic for the patient, and there's also a danger of secondary infection if it's left in too long. So, the ideal management is to identify the bleeding point and stop the bleeding directly by cauterizing it or by ligation of the vessel. And this primary treatment will work in 94% of cases. So, before I go on to the next stage of my talk,